Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring Mars, Volume 3. Native Son by T.D. Hamm. The Frogs of Mars by Roger D. Welcome, Martians by S.A. Lombino. 2 Weeks in August by Frank M. Robinson. Murderer's Chain by Wenzell Brown. The Frogs of Mars by Roger D. Aycock, writing as Roger D. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, April 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. There was nothing special about the little man who came into Larry's place, unless it might have been his air of vague familiarity and the mixed expression on his face. He looked disgusted and defensive, and at the same time a little resentful, with a dash of something else thrown in which none of us recognized until later. I'd have mistaken him for another reporter from the Advertiser across the street if the 5 newsmen already at the bar hadn't given each other a blank look that meant only one thing: none of them knew him. Neither did Larry, who was trying to bring in the first broadcast from Mars on the television set bracketed on the wall over his whiskey stock, and who wasn't pleased at having his little after-hours party crashed. "The bar's closed," Larry said. His tone didn't invite argument. "City ordinance. No customers after 1 a.m. The little man looked at the clock, which said 3:15, and then at the front windows, which were shuttered tight. Then he looked at the 6 of us sitting at the bar with our drinks. "I'll have bourbon and water," he said. He sat down at the end of the bar on the stool next to mine and looked at his reflection in the mirror without approval. Larry got the look that bartenders get with troublesome customers. "The bar's closed," he said again. "It's a city." "Water on the side," the little man said. "Don't mix it." Abe Marker, who does sports for the Advertiser, got up and checked the front door lock. The thumb catch hadn't been thrown, so Abe put it on and came back to the bar. "Nobody else will wander in," he said. "Make with the TV, Larry. You're holding up the show." Larry looked stubborn. "It's after 1 a.m., he said, "and that door was supposed to be locked. There's a city ordinance." "You're breaking it already," the little man said, looking at us. He didn't seem angry, just weary and disgusted. "Not that I give a damn. All I want is a bourbon and water." "Better give it to him, Larry," Willard Saxton said from down the bar. Willard is the Advertiser's science editor and is an authority on the planets, especially Mars. "He'll probably turn you in if you throw him out." Larry muttered and looked mulish, but he rang up the little man's money and gave him a bourbon and water. The little guy drank it and looked at himself in the bar mirror with an expression that was just short of being a sneer. Larry grunted and went back to fiddling with the television set. Abe Marker came over and sat down on the stool to my left. "They're doing this all over town tonight," he said, explaining to the little man across me. "The bars have to observe curfew as usual, but most of them are letting a few regular customers stay late to see the Mars cast. Everybody is anxious to know what Colonel Sanderson and his crew found up there, so—" "They're going to be disappointed," the little man said. He sounded sour but positive. "Mars ain't what people think it is, not by a hell of a sight. It stinks." We all looked up at that, and somebody snickered. "Have you been to Mars, sir?" The little man didn't seem to mind when we laughed. "Maybe," he said, and shoved his shot glass forward. "Another bourbon, bartender." The station announcer came on screen then, and told us what we already knew, that contact with Colonel Sanderson's party was delayed because of transmission difficulties. The Sanderson expedition would leave Mars for Earth in 2 more days, when the current opposition was completed, but in the meantime the program sponsors appreciated the interest shown by their public and would relay the broadcast to us as soon as contact was established. A film cartoon featuring a lizard named Freddy came on next, and Larry turned down the sound so he could hear orders for refills. The little man drank his bourbon and water, and sneered at his reflection in the mirror. None of us paid him any further attention, but talk started up again along the bar. Somebody at the other end asked how long it took a television signal to travel across all that space, and choked on his drink when Willard Saxon told him. "My God," he said when he stopped coughing, "you mean Mars is so far away it takes 3 minutes just to see it?" All of us laughed at that, but Larry and the little man at the end of the bar. "What I'm wondering," somebody else said, "is how the Colonel and his boys feel after breathing nothing but canned air for a year." "Maybe the air up there is better than us scientists think," Abe Marcus said. He winked at us and looked at the little man on my right. "How about it, friend? Is the air good on Mars?" "Breathable, but not good," the little guy said. "It smells like dead fish." Silence fell along the bar while we waited for a straight man to raise his head. Willard Saxon took the bait. "And why would it smell so, may I ask?" "Because Mars is lousy with fish," the little man said, "and because when fish die, they stink." Larry did a brisk business for a few minutes while we sized the little guy up again. He definitely wasn't drunk, but the task of deciding whether he was being deadpan comic or just nasty was the sort of challenge that called for thought. "But you'd need extensive oceans to support so many fish," Willard Saxon argued, still taking it seriously. "And if Mars has oceans, we'd have seen them long ago. They reflect light." "Mars is too level for oceans," the little man said. "The water spreads out thin to make one big marsh, and you can't see it because the weeds that grow up from the bottom camouflage it." Somebody down the bar said, "This gets curiouser and curiouser," and everybody laughed again, but Willard and Larry and the little comic. Somebody else asked if he was a professional and what show was he on, but he didn't answer. He just pushed his shot glass forward instead. "Another bourbon," he said. The announcer came on screen again when the lizard cartoon went off, and said that the Mars party's signal was beginning to come through, and that as soon as it cleared up they would put it on the cable. Then he told us about a new kind of pretzel prepared with a special salt guaranteed not to give us hardening of the arteries, and after that we had another film cartoon. This one was about 2 crows at a circus, but nobody could follow it because Larry turned down the sound again. Between his 3rd and 4th stingers, Willard Saxon, who had a reputation to uphold, being science editor of the Advertiser, had made up his mind by now to put the little man in his place. It burned him brown to see his character drinking bourbon and sneering at himself in the mirror and not caring a damn what we thought, and it put Willard under a sort of obligation to show him up. "Reliable tests have conclusively proved," Willard said, "that the atmosphere of Mars contains only minute traces of water vapor, and that its oxygen content is less than 1/100th the density necessary to sustain human life. Spectroanalysis findings." "A spectroanalysis of Earth from Mars," the little man said, "shows nothing beyond our heaviside layer, and proves that we can't live there because nothing can breathe pure ozone." He finishes his bourbon and made up chains of wet ring on the bar top with his glass. The mixed look on his face was so strong that for a moment I almost thought of the name for it. Willard stalled for time by ordering another stinger, a double this time, and Abe Marker took over. "How about those pictures of Martian dust storms the boys at Palomar make?" Abe asked. "You can't have dust storms on a marshy planet, can you?" "Those aren't dust storms," the little man said. "They're clouds of gnats." "Gnats?" we all said at once, and somebody down the bar, quicker-witted than the rest of us, added, "Gnats to you, Charlie." "A fact," the little man said, but not as if he cared. "They travel in swarms thousands of miles wide, and they bite like hell." We sat and watched the 2 voiceless crows flap through the television cartoon for a while. Nobody spoke until the film was over and the screen went blank, when the little man caught Larry's eye and held up one finger. "Bourbon," he said. We heard a confused muttering of voices in the background and waited expectantly for Colonel Sanderson to speak to us from Mars. But apparently the network people were still having trouble with their transmission beam. The screen stayed blank. "You left out the interesting part, Charlie," somebody called from down the bar. "The Martian natives, what about them?" "There aren't any, as you'd know them," the little man said. He seemed to grow thoughtful for a moment. "But they are intelligent. They do things you couldn't do." "Such as what?" somebody asked. The little man shrugged. "Teleport. They're good at it too." Saxton let out a laugh. "That would make them more intelligent than us," he said. "What do these Martians look like?" The little man screwed up his face distastefully. "Frogs." The reporter who had asked about natives got choked on his drink and had to be pounded on the back. On my left, Abe Marker leaned against the bar to look past me at the little guy. "Frogs we got now," he said admiringly. "By the billions?" "There are more frogs on Mars," the little man said, "than there are gnats and fish together, and they never stop croaking. You'd have to hear it to believe it." The television screen lit up suddenly, chopping off conversation, and we were watching the first Marscast in history. Colonel Sanderson himself was talking. He looked the way Stanley must have looked when he found Livingston, gaunt and bearded and jumpy, and his crew, lined up behind him before the ship's pickup camera, were in no better shape. The lot of them stared hungrily out at us as if they had just found a peephole into heaven and couldn't wait to see if there was a gate farther along the fence. "Established conceptions of Martian aerography are completely erroneous," the colonel was saying. "There are no drifting deserts of sand or howling typhoons of ferrous dust. We can show you actual conditions better by camera, I think, and they can be detailed in words." The view jumped to another camera aimed from an outside port, and we saw Mars. Colonel Sanderson's voice kept up a running commentary behind the scene, but we only half heard him. The ship rested in about 2 feet of water. Around it, the whole world curved up to the horizon in a shallow concave sweep, like the inside of a great rusty bowl, lined with knee-high reeds that grew as far as the eye could see out of a knee-deep marsh. A fist-sized sun hung low in the sky, its glare dulled to a muddy crimson by a shimmering cloud of gnats that whirled and danced to infinity. There was a sort of vast, featureless roaring in the background that sounded like Niagara at 200 yards, not deafening, but loud enough to force Colonel Sanderson to raise his voice. "The frog noise is worst," he was saying. "It drives us to the point of insanity at times. One member of our party has succumbed to it already, a machinist named Wilkins who disappeared 2 weeks ago. Apparently the poor fellow drowned himself in the marsh, since no trace of him has been found since." That was when I realized why the little man on the stool beside me looked so familiar, because I'd seen his pictures in the papers, along with the rest of Sanderson's crew, 1,000 times during the past year. The mixed expression on his face made sense now too. He wasn't only disgusted and defensive, he was guilty. "So that's how you knew what it was like," I said. "You couldn't stick it out with the others, so you jumped ship. You deserted." He gave me a hangdog look. "It's not deserting unless the country is at war," he said. "It's just going over the hill. AWOL." The television roar got louder, and when I looked up at the ship's cameraman was doing a close-up for our benefit. He panned the shot downward until we seemed to be standing 10 feet above the marsh, and at that distance I could see plainly what it was that caused the uproar. The water between the reddish-brown reeds was thick with huge frogs, all blinking and croaking like mad. I remember thinking then that you couldn't really blame a man for jumping ship in a hole like that. It was bad enough to be stuck 30-odd million miles from home, so far that light itself needed 3 minutes to... "Hey, wait up," I said to the little guy who was sneering at himself in the mirror again. "If you went AWOL up there, then how the hell did you get back here?" I didn't find out. The guy was gone. He had been standing there so close I could have touched him, but now he was gone. I looked around quick. Nobody else seemed to have noticed. All eyes were on the TV screen. Then I saw it. On the floor. 2 wet marks right where the guy should have been. Where he was. 2 wet marks that had a funny shape to them, web-like. I felt my throat tighten at the thought. I shook my head. What was going through it was fantastic, impossible, and downright lunacy. There was an intelligent life form on Mars. Beings that looked like frogs and could teleport. Could they also mimic human shape temporarily? Especially if they got hold of one for a model. Say a missing crewman. "Hey, where are you going? Don't you want to see the Mars cast?" I was walking to the door. I looked back at the barkeep. "I've seen enough, Larry. I got things to do." He shrugged. "Yeah, what?" "Like hunting frogs," I told him as I shoved the door open. "I got a hunch we'll be doing a lot of that before very long." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Welcome, Martians, by S.A. Lombino, writing as Evan Hunter, originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, May 1952, narrated by Tom Trussel. The only sound was the swish of the jets against the sand as the big ship came down. Slowly, nose pointed skyward, a yellow tail streaming out behind the tubes, it settled to the ground like a cat nuzzling its haunches against a velvet pillow. Dave Langley peered through the viewport. "I feel kind of funny," he said. A tremor of excitement flooded through Carl Manner's thin frame. "Mars," he whispered. "We made it." Gently, the fins probed the sand, poking into it. Cal cut the power, and the big ship shuddered and relaxed, a huge metal spider with a conical head. Cal peered through the viewport, his eyes scanning the planet. Behind him, Dave shrugged into a spacesuit, gathered up his instruments. "I'll make the tests," Dave said. "Keep the starboard guns trained on me." Cal nodded. He walked Dave to the airlock and lifted the toggles on the inner hatch. Dave stepped into the small chamber, and Cal snapped the hatch shut. He walked quickly to the starboard guns, wheeled into the plastic seat behind them, and pitched his shoulders against the braces. Outside, like a grotesque balloon, Dave stumbled around on weighted feet, taking his readings. "What's out there?" Cal wondered. "Just exactly what?" He tightened his grip on the big blasters and trained the guns around to where Dave puttered in the sand. Dave suddenly stood erect, waved at Cal, and started lumbering back toward the ship. Cal left the guns and went to the airlock. He stepped into the chamber, closed the toggles on the hatch behind him, and twirled the wheel on the outer hatch. He was ready to move back into the ship again when Dave stepped through the outer hatch, his helmet under his arm. "It's okay, Cal. Breathable atmosphere. And the pressure is all right, too." Cal let out a sigh of relief. "Come on," he said. "Get out of that monkey suit. Then we'll claim the planet for Earth." They went back into the ship, and Dave took off the suit, hanging it carefully in its locker. Both men strapped on holsters and drew stun guns from the munition locker. They checked the charges in their weapons, holstered them, and stepped out into the Martian night. It was cold, but their clothing was warm, and the air was invigorating. Cal looked up at the sky. "Phobos," he said, pointing. "And Deimos," Dave added. "Ike and Mike." "Yeah," Dave smiled. "How do you feel, Dave?" Cal asked suddenly. "How do you mean?" Mars. I mean, we're the first men to land on Mars. The first, Dave." They were walking aimlessly, in no particular hurry. "It's funny," Dave said. "I told you before. I feel kind of—" The music started abruptly, almost exploded into being, tore through the silence of the planet like the strident scream of a wounded animal. Trumpets blasted raucously, trombones moaned and slid, bass drums pounded a steady tattoo, tubas heavy and solemn like old men belching, clarinets shrill and squealing, cymbals clashing. A military band blaring its march into the night. "What?" Dave's mouth hung open. He stared into the distance. There were lights, and the brass gleamed dully. A group of men were marching toward them, blowing on their horns, waving brilliant banners in the air. "People," Cal said. "And music, like ours. Music just like ours." The procession spilled across the sand like an unravelling spool of brightly coloured silk. Children danced on the outskirts of the group, hopping up and down, screaming in glee. Women waved banners, sang along with the band, and the music shouted out across the sand, a triumphal march with a lively beat. A fat man led the procession. He was beaming, his smile a great enamelled gash across his face. The music became louder, closer, ear-shattering now. "Welcome!" the shouts rang out. "Welcome! Welcome!" "English?" The word escaped Dave's lips in a sudden hiss. "For God's sake, Cal, they're speaking English!" "Something's wrong," Cal said tightly. "This isn't Mars. We've made a mistake, Dave." The fat man was closer now, still grinning, his stomach protruding, a gold watch hanging across his vest beneath his jacket. He wore a white carnation in his buttonhole. A Homburg black was perched solidly atop his head. "They're human," Dave whispered. The fat man stopped before them, raised his hands. The music ceased as abruptly as it had begun. He stepped forward and extended his hand. "Welcome home," he said. "Welcome home." The words seared across Cal's mind with sudden understanding. "There's some mistake," he started. "Mistake?" the fat man chuckled. "Nonsense, nonsense. I am Mayor Pandley. You're back in New Calais, gentlemen. The city is yours. The world is yours. Welcome home." "You don't understand," Cal persisted. "We've just come from Earth. We've just travelled more than 50 million miles through space. We're from Earth." "I know," the mayor said. "I know." "You know?" "But of course. Isn't it wonderful?" The crowd cheered behind him, telling the night how wonderful it was. Cal blinked, turned to Dave. The mayor put his arms around the two men. "We've been watching your approach for weeks. I'll have to admit we were a little worried in the beginning." "Worried?" The mayor began chuckling again. "Why, yes, yes. Not that we didn't think you'd make it, but there were some who— here are the television trucks now." The trucks wheeled across the sand, just like the thousands of trucks Cal had seen back on Earth. The television cameras pointed down at them, and the men stood behind them with earphones on. "Smile, smile," the mayor whispered. Cal smiled. Dave smiled too. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Pandley said to the cameras, "it is a distinct honour of New Calais—" The crowd raised their voices, drowning out his voice. The banners waved, yellow, red, blue, orange. "Welcome, welcome, welcome." "The distinct honour of New Calais to be able to welcome home Bobby Gayless and Gary Dale." "Gayless, Dale," the voices sang. "Gayless, Dale, Gayless, Dale." "Just a second," Cal interrupted. "You don't understand at all. Those aren't our—" "4 years in space," the mayor continued. 4 years among the stars, to Earth and back, fellow citizens, for the glory of Mars." "You've got that twisted," Cal said. "We didn't—" The mayor took Cal's elbow and turned him toward the cameras. "You were in space for 4 years, weren't you, Captain Galis?" "Yes, we were, but it wasn't—" "Space," the mayor gushed. "Limitless space. The first men to land on Earth." Again the cries of the crowd split the night. "Across the stretches of sky," the mayor continued, "across the uncharted wilderness above, across the—" There were banquets and more banquets, and women of every size and shape. The city of New Calith went all out to welcome the space travellers, Bobby Galis and Gary Dale. At the end of a week of festivity, the mayor came to Cal and Dave. "Have you enjoyed your stay, boys?" he asked. "It was swell," Cal said, "but you've got things all—" "I was wondering when you planned on leaving for the capital. Don't misunderstand me. We'd like you to stay as long as you want to, but—" "For God's sake," Cal snapped, "will you please listen to me?" Mayor Panley was visibly shaken. "Why, of course, Captain Galis, of course, why, certainly." He lapsed into silence. "I'm not Bobby Galis," Cal said, "and this isn't Gary Dale." The mayor nodded his head. "You're not Galis and Dale?" he said slowly. "That's right," Cal said. "We didn't go to Earth. We came from there. This is the first time we've ever been on Mars. Do you understand? We're Earthmen." "Earthmen?" The mayor considered this for a second, then burst out laughing. "Why, that's preposterous! Absolutely preposterous!" His laugh rose in volume to a bellow. "Oh, you're joking! I should have known. You're only joking." "We're not joking. This is all some kind of horrible mistake. We're the first men to land on Mars. You've got to understand that," Dave pleaded. The mayor was still laughing. He walked to the door and opened it. "All right, boys, have your little joke. You've earned the right to it. I'll make arrangements for you to leave for Dome City in the morning." He shook his head and chuckled again. "Earthmen!" And then he was gone. They sat alone in the hotel room. It looked like any Earth hotel they'd ever been in. A big soft bed, a wall telephone, 2 dressers, 2 armchairs, a big mirror over one of the dressers, a television set on the other dresser. "This is screwy," Dave said. "Is it possible we're back on Earth? Is it possible the joke is on us? Maybe everyone is just ribbing us. Maybe we've been going around in circles for 4 years. Maybe—" "No," Cal said. "We're on Mars all right. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but I've got an idea." "What's that?" Dave asked. Cal shrugged. "Probably all wrong, of course, but it has something to do with comparable development of cultures on different planets." "You mean Mars is in exactly the same state of development as Earth?" "Something like that. You know the theory. Give 2 different places the same materials to start with, and the cultures will run parallel to each other for the rest of their existence." "Sure," Dave said. "But these guys, Galis and Dale, how the hell could we possibly be mistaken for them?" "I don't know." Cal leaned back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. "Maybe we'll find out in Dome City." "Maybe," Dave repeated hollowly. The president of the planet greeted their ship in Dome City. There were more parades, banners, bands, banquets, reporters, cameras, confetti, women, speeches, presentations. And at last they stood before the president's desk, 2 bodyguards standing on either side of him. He was a thin man, slightly balding, with rimless glasses. "Gentlemen," he said, "I don't have to tell you how pleased I am." Cal took a deep breath. "We've been trying to tell Mayor Panley," he said, "that we are not Galis and Dale." The president smiled. "I know. He told me of your little joke." "It's not a joke." The president cocked an eyebrow. "No?" He looked at his bodyguards. "Has space effect... Did you feel any ill effects in space?" he asked. Cal grimaced. "Oh, great. Now he thinks we're psycho. Look, can't you get this through your heads? We are from Earth. We never heard of Galis and Dale. My name is Calvin Manners, and this is David Langley." Very interesting, the President said. He tapped his fingers on the back of his other hand and stared at the two Earthmen. He reached over toward the intercom on his desk then and pressed a button. "Yes?" a woman's voice asked. "Miss Daniels, will you bring in the photos of Captain Galis and Lieutenant Dale, please?" "Yes, sir." The President turned to the two men again. "Those are your ranks, are they not?" "Yes, but we're in the United States Army." "The what?" "The United States Army. The United States is a country on Earth." "Really? Now we're getting somewhere. What else does Earth have? What is it like? Are the inhabitants intelligent?" "Yes, we are. We're Earthmen. Can't you understand that?" "I think you're carrying this joke a little too far, gentlemen. A joke is a joke, but we've spent millions of dollars on your trip. Really, this is no time for banter." Cal opened his mouth, ready to protest, just as the outside door swung wide. An attractive blonde in a smart suit stepped into the room and walked to the President's desk. She kept her eyes glued to the two Earthmen, dropped two large photographs on the desk, and turned. She stared over her shoulder at Cal and Dave until she was gone. The President smiled knowingly. "The women are falling all over you two, I imagine." "We're both married," Cal said dryly. "We don't care for all this." "Married?" The President was shocked. "I thought we'd distinctly chosen unmarried men for the job. Strange." "We've got wives on Earth," Dave said. "Aha," the President said. "Then they are intelligent beings. Pity, pity." A twinge of anticipation curled up Cal's spine. "Pity? Why a pity? Why do you say that?" "Well, you know. Surely you realize that this was the only flight we could afford." "What?" "For the meantime, anyway. We may attempt another flight in 50 years, 60 perhaps, maybe more. But you've already proved space travel, Captain Galis. The achievement is ours. All we need now is money to—" "Damn it, I'm not Captain Galis," Cal shouted. "And we've got to get back to Earth. I've got a kid, Mr. President. He's 6 years old and—" Cal stopped abruptly. "Oh, this is all nonsense. Why am I arguing with you? Can't you understand that we are Earthmen? What do we have to do to prove it?" The President sighed and turned over the photographs on the desk. There were glossy prints of two men in uniform. They were young men, in khaki, smiles on their faces. One man looked exactly like Calvin Manners. The other strongly resembled David Langley. "Here are your photographs," the President said. "This is you, Captain, and you, Lieutenant. They were taken before the trip. You're younger, of course." Cal stared at the photograph. It could have been he. The nose was a little sharper, perhaps, and the face thinner. But it could have been he. It could have been he. "It's a freak accident," he shouted. "A coincidence in two parallel cultures. He saw the look on the President's face then. It was a cold look, and a suspicious one. Cal stopped speaking, sweat staining the armpits of his uniform shirt. The President grinned again. "That's better. I understand the strain of space, gentlemen, but we must be practical, mustn't we?" He paused. "Shall we talk about Earth now?" The only sound was the swish of the jets against the grass as the big ship came down. Slowly, nose pointed skyward, a yellow tail streaming out behind the tubes, it settled to the ground like a cat nuzzling its haunches against a velvet pillow. In the distance, the lights of New York danced crazily, gleaming from 1,000 spires that scratched the sky. The radios blared forth excitedly, and the police cars screamed through the night as they rushed to City Hall to pick up the mayor. Inside the ship, Gary Dale peered through the viewport. "I feel kind of funny," he said. A tremor of excitement flooded through Bobby Gaylor's thin frame. "Earth," he whispered. "We made it."
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
2 Weeks in August by Frank M. Robinson, originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, February 1951. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I suppose there's a guy like McCleary in every office. Now, I'm not a hard man to get along with, and it usually takes quite a bit more than overly bright remarks from the office boy to bother me. But try as I might, I could never get along with McCleary. To be as disliked as he was, you have to work at it. What kind of a guy was he? Well, if he came down to the office one day proud as punch because of something little Johnny or Josephine had said, it was a sure cinch that McCleary would horn in with something his little Louis had spouted off that morning. At any rate, when McCleary got through, you felt like taking Johnny to the doctor to find out what made him subnormal. Or maybe you happened to buy a new Super 8 that week and were bragging about the mileage, the terrific pickup, and how quickly she responded to the wheel. Leave it to McCleary to give a quick rundown on his own car that would make you feel like selling yours for junk at the nearest scrap heap. Well, you see what I mean. But by far the worst of it was when vacation time rolled around. You could forgive a guy for topping you about how brainy his kids are, and you might even find it in your heart to forget the terrific bargain he drove to work in. But vacation time was when he'd really get on your nerves. You could pack the wife and kids in Old Reliable and roll out to the lake for your 2 weeks in August. You might even break the bank and spend the 2 weeks at a poor man's Sun Valley. But no matter where you went, when you came back, you'd have to sit in silence and listen to McCleary's account of his vacation in the Adirondacks, or his tramp in the Canadian wilds, or maybe even the old French Quarter. The trouble was, he always had the photographs, the ticket stubs, and the souvenirs to prove it. Where he got the money, I'll never know. Sometimes I'd tell the wife about it, and she'd sniff and wonder what kind of shabby house they lived in that they could afford all the other things. I never looked him up myself. Tell you the truth, I was afraid I'd find the McClearys lived on Park Avenue. Now you look forward to a vacation all year, but particularly during the latter part of July, when, what with the heat and the stuffy office, you begin to feel like a half-done hot dog at a barbecue. I was feeling even worse than usual as I was faced with spending my 2 weeks in my own backyard, most of my vacation dough having gone to pay the doctor. The only thing I minded was having McCleary find out about it, and seeing that phony look of sympathy roll across his fat face while he rambled on about the vacation he was going to have. It was lunchtime, and we had just finished talking about the latest on television and what was wrong with the administration and who'd win the pennant when Bob Young brought up the subject of vacations. It turned out he was due for a trip to the Ozarks, and Donnelly was going after walleye pike in northern Wisconsin. I could sense McCleary prick up his ears clear across the room. "How about you, Bill?" Donnelly asked me. "Got any plans?" I winked heavily and jerked a thumb warningly toward McCleary, making sure McCleary couldn't see the gesture. "My vacation is really going to be out of the world this time," I said. "Me and the wife are going to Mars. Dry, you know. Even better than Arizona for her sinus." Even with the wink, they were caught off guard for a minute. "Mars?" Donnelly said feebly, edging his chair away. "Yeah, sure. Great place. Never been there myself, though." Young just gaped, then grinned as he caught on. "I understand it's a wonderful spot," he chipped in. I casually peeled a hard-boiled egg the wife had packed in my lunch bucket and leaned back in my swivel chair. "It's really swell," I said dreamily, but loud enough so McCleary couldn't help but overhear. Drifting down the Grand Canal at evening, the sun a faint golden disk behind the crystal towers of Marsport. I let my voice drift into a long sigh and reached for Donnelly's sack of grapes. About this time, McCleary had gnawed his way through a big pastrami sandwich and waddled over. He stood there expectantly, but we carefully ignored him. "Always wanted to go myself," Donnelly said in the same tone of voice he would have used to say he'd like to go to California some day. "Pretty expensive, though, isn't it?" "Expensive?" I raised a studiedly surprised eyebrow. "Oh, I suppose a little, but it's worth it. The wife and I got a roomette on the Princess of Mars for $139.50. That's one way, of course." "Mars," Young sighed wistfully. There was a moment of silence, with all three of us paying silent tribute to the ultimate in vacations. McCleary slowly masticated a leaf of lettuce, his initial look of suspicion giving way to half-belief. "Let's hear some more about it," Young said enthusiastically, suddenly recovering from his reverie. "Oh, there isn't much more," I said indifferently. "We plan to stay at the Red Sands Hotel in Marsport. American plan. Take in Marsport, with maybe a side trip to Crystallite. If we have time, we might even take a waterway cruise to the North Pole." I broke off and dug Donnelly in the ribs. "Man, you never fished until you have a Martian flying fish at the end of the line." I grabbed a ruler off the desk and began using it as an imaginary rod and reel. "Talk about fight—" "Oh, sorry, Mac." My ruler had amputated part of a floppy lettuce leaf that hung from McCleary's sandwich. I settled down in my chair again and started paying attention to my lunch. "Nothing like it," I added between mouthfuls of liverwurst. "How about entertainment?" Young winked slyly. "Well, you know, the wife will be along," I said. "But some of the places near the Grand Canal. And those Martian mist maidens. Brother, if I was unattached." "There ain't any life on Mars," McCleary said, suspicious again. All three of us looked at him in shocked silence. "He says there's no life on Mars," Donnelly repeated. "You ever been there, McCleary?" I asked sarcastically. "No, but just the same." "All right," I cut in. "Then you don't know whether there is or isn't, so kindly reserve your opinion until you know a little about the subject under discussion." I turned back to Donnelly and Young. "Really a wonderful place for your health. Dry, thin air, nice and cool at night, and beautiful. From Marsport you can see low-slung mountains in the distance, dunes of soft red sand stretching out to them. If I were you, Bob, I'd forget all about the Ozarks and sign up on the rocket." "There ain't any rockets going to Mars," McCleary said obstinately. "Isn't," I corrected. "I mean, there is. Besides, McCleary, just because you never heard of something doesn't mean it doesn't exist." "The government's still working on V2, McCleary said flatly. "They haven't even reached the moon yet." I sighed softly, acting disgusted at having to deal with somebody as stupid as McCleary. "Mac, that's the government, and besides, they're dealing with military rockets. And did you ever hear of the government perfecting something before private industry? Who perfected the telephone, the radio, television? The government? No, private industry, of course. Private industry has always been ahead of the government on everything, including rockets. Get on this dick, Mac." McCleary started in on his lettuce leaf again, looking very shrewd. "How come I never heard of it before now?" he asked, springing the clincher argument. "Look, Mac, this is relatively new. The company's just starting. Can't afford to take full-page ads and that sort of thing. Just give him time, that's all. Why, a couple of years from now you'll be spending your vacation on Venus or Jupiter or someplace like that. From now on, California and the Bahamas will be strictly old hat." McCleary looked half-believing. "Where'd you get your tickets?" I waved vaguely in the direction of downtown. "Oh, there must be at least a couple of agencies downtown. Might even be able to find them in the phone book. Look under Interplanetary Rocket Lines or something like that. You might have a little difficulty, of course. Like I say, they're not too well advertised." McCleary was about to say something more, But then the 1 o'clock bell rang, and we went back to the office grind. Well, McCleary didn't say anything more about it the next day, even though we'd throw in a chance comment about Mars every now and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But Mac didn't rise to the bait. We gradually forgot about it. The next couple of weeks came and went, and then my 2 weeks in August. Like I said before, my vacation dough had gone to pay the doctor, so I stayed at home and watered the begonias. The Monday morning after vacation, we were all back in the office, if anything, looking more fagged than we had when we left. When lunchtime rolled around, Donnelly and Young and I piled our lunches on Donnelly's desk. His desk was near a window on the north side of the building, so he could get the breeze, and talked about what we had done during vacation. McCleary ambled up, and like it usually does after McCleary comes around, the conversation just naturally died down. After 2 minutes' silence, I finally took the hook. "Okay, Mac," I said, "I know you're just dying to tell us. Where did you go?" He looked almost surprised. "To Mars," he said, like he might have said Aunt Minnie's. The three of us looked blank for a minute, and then we caught on. It took us a while to recover from laughing, and my sides were still aching when I saw McCleary's face. It definitely had a hurt look on it. "You don't think I did?" he accused us. "Oh, come off it, McCleary," I said crossly. "A gag's a gag, but it can be carried too far. Where'd you go? California? Oregon? Some place like that?" "I said I went to Mars," McCleary repeated hotly, "and I can prove it." "Sure," I said, "like I can prove the world's flat, and it's supported by 4 elephants standing on a turtle's back like the old Greeks." I cut off. McCleary had thrown a couple of pasteboards on the desk, and I picked them up. The printing on it was like you see on a Pullman ticket. It said something about a roomette, first-class passage on the Martian Prince for $154.75, and there was even a place where they had the tax figured. In 2 blanks at the top of the ticket, they had it filled out to E.C. McCleary and wife. The bottom half was torn off, just like they do with train tickets. "Very clever," I said, "but you shouldn't have gone to all that trouble to have these printed up." McCleary scowled and dropped a little bunch of Kodachrome slides on the desk. I took one and held it up to the light. It showed Mac and his wife mounted on something that looked like a cross between a camel and a zebra. They were at the top of a sand dune, and in the distance you could see the towers of a city. The funny thing was, the towers looked a little, but not much, like minarets, and the sand dunes were coloured a beautiful pink. I passed it on to Donnelly and Young and started leafing through the rest. They were beautiful slides. McCleary and spouse in front of various structures in delicately tinted marble and crystal city. McCleary in a pink and black boat on a canal that looked as wide as the Mississippi. McCleary standing on a strangely carved sandstone parapet, admiring a sunset caused by a sun looking half as big as ours. And everywhere were the dunes of pink sand. "Pictures can be faked, Mac," I said. He looked hurt and got some things out of his desk. A sateen pillow with scenes like those on his snapshots. An urn filled with pink sand. A tiny boat like a gondola, only difference. A letter opener made out of peculiarly bubbly pink glass. They were all stamped, "Souvenir of Mars," and that kind of junk you don't have made up for a gag. I know mass-produced articles when I see them. "We couldn't afford the first-class tour," McCleary said expansively, "but I figure we can cover that next year." He turned to me puzzledly. I asked the passenger agent about the Princess of Mars, and he said he had never heard of the ship, and it's Mars City, not Marsport. Couldn't understand how you made a mistake. "It was easy," I said weakly. I pointed to the pasteboard ducats. "Where'd you get these, Mac?" He waved generously in the direction of downtown. "Like you said, there's a couple of agencies downtown." You know, sometimes I think we misjudged McCleary. It takes a while to get to know a guy like Mac. Maybe his Louis is brighter than Johnny, and maybe his Chugmobile is something terrific. For the last few years, all on account of Mac, my 2 weeks in August have been really well spent, beautiful. Why, from Mars City you can see low-slung mountains in the distance and dunes of soft red sands stretching out to them. And the sunsets when you're standing on the parapets of that delicate crystal city. And man, fishing in the Grand Canal. How do you get to Mars? There's probably a couple of agencies in your own town. You can look them up in your phone book under Vacation at the Planets of Pleasure, or something like that. They might be a little difficult to find, though. You see, they're not very well advertised yet.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Native Son by T.D. Hamm, originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, July 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Tommy Benton, on his first visit to Earth, found the long-anticipated wonders of 21st century New York thrilling the first week, boring and unhappy the second week, and at the end of the third he was definitely ready to go home. The never-ending racket of traffic was torture to his abnormally acute ears. Increased atmospheric pressure did funny things to his chest and stomach, and quick and sure-footed on Mars, he struggled constantly against the heavy gravity that made all his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. The endless canyons of towering buildings, with their connecting skywalks, oppressed and smothered him. Remembering the endless vistas of rabarra fields beside a canal that was like an inland sea, homesickness flooded over him. He hated the people who stared at him with either open or hidden amusement. His Aunt B, for instance, who looked him up and down with frank disapproval and said loudly, "For heaven's sake, Helen, take him to a good tailor and get those bones covered up." Was it his fault that he was 6 inches taller than Terran boys his age, and had long, thin arms and legs? Or that his chest was abnormally developed to compensate for an oxygen-thin atmosphere? I'd like to see her, he thought fiercely, out on the flatlands. She'd be gasping like a canal fish out of water. Even his parents, happily riding their social merry-go-round of terror after 11 years in the Martian flatlands, didn't seem to understand how he felt. "Don't you like Earth, Tommy?" queried his mother anxiously. "Oh, it's all right, I guess." "A nice place to visit," said his father sardonically. "But I wouldn't live here if they gave me the place," said his mother, and they both burst out laughing for no reason that Tommy could see. Of course, they did that lots of times at home, and Tommy laughed with them just for the warm, secure feeling of belonging. This time he didn't feel like laughing. "When are we going home?" he repeated stubbornly. His father pulled Tommy over the crook of his arm and said gently, "Well, not right away, son. As a matter of fact, how would you like to stay here and go to school?" Tommy pulled away and looked at him incredulously. "I've been to school." "Well, yes," admitted his father, "but only to the colony schools. You don't want to grow up and be an ignorant Martian sandfoot all your life, do you?" "Yes, I do. I want to be a Martial Sandfoot, and I want to go home where people don't look at me and say, 'So this is your little Martian.'" Benton Sr. put his arm around Tommy's stiffly resistant shoulders. "Look here, old man," he said persuasively. "I thought you wanted to be a space engineer. You can't do that without an education, you know, and your Aunt Bee will take good care of you." Tommy faced him stubbornly. "I don't want to be any old spaceman. I want to be a sandfoot like old Pete, and I want to go home." Helen bit back a smile at the two earnest, stubborn faces so ridiculously alike, and hastened to avert the gathering storm. "Now look, fellows, Tommy's career doesn't have to be decided in the next 5 minutes. After all, he's only 10. He can make up his mind later on if he wants to be an engineer or a barra farmer. Right now, he's going to stay here and go to school. And I'm staying with him." Resolutely avoiding both crestfallen faces, Helen, having shepherded Tommy to bed, returned to the living room acutely conscious of Big Tom's bleak, hurt gaze at her back. "Helen, you're going to make a sissy out of the boy," he said at last. "There isn't any reason why he can't stay here at home with Bee." Helen turned to face him. "Earth isn't home to Tommy, and your sister Bee told him he ought to be out playing football with the boys instead of hanging around the house." "But she knows the doctor said he'd have to take it easy for a year till he was accustomed to the change in gravity and air pressure," he answered incredulously. "Exactly. She also asked me," Helen went on grimly, "if I thought he'd be less of a freak as he got older." Tom Benton swore. Bee always did have less sense than the average hen, he gritted. "My son a freak! Hell's bells!" Tommy, arriving at the hall door in time to hear the tail end of the sentence, crept back to bed feeling numb and dazed. So even his father thought he was a freak. The last few days before parting was one of strain for all of them. If Tommy was unnaturally subdued, no one noticed it. His parents were not feeling any great impulse toward gaiety either. They all went dutifully sightseeing as before. They saw the zoo and went shopping on the skywalks, and on the last day wound up at the great showrooms of Androids Incorporated. Tommy had hated them on sight. They were at once too human and too inhuman for comfort. The hotel was full of them, and most private homes had at least one. Now they saw the great incubating vats, and the processing, and finally the showroom where one of the finished products was on display as a maid, sweeping and dusting. "That one's a dead ringer for you, Helen, if you were a little better looking, that is." Tommy's dad pretended to compare them judicially. Helen laughed, but Tommy looked at him with a resentfulness. Comparing his mother to an android. "They say for a little extra you can get an exact resemblance. Maybe I'd better have one fixed up like you to take back with me," Big Tom added teasingly. Then as Helen's face clouded over, "Oh, hun, you know I was only kidding. Let's get out of here. This place gives me the collywobbles. Besides, I've got to pick up my watch." But his mother's face was still unhappy, and Tommy glowered sullenly at his father's back all the way to the watch shop. It was a small shop, with an inconspicuous sign down in one corner of the window that said only "Crumbine Watches," and was probably the most famous shop of its kind in the world. Every spaceman landing on Terra left his watch to be checked by the dusty little old man who was the genius of the place. Tommy ranged wide-eyed about the clock and chronometer-crammed interior. He stopped fascinated before the last case. In it was a watch. But what a watch! Besides the regulation Terran dial, it had a second smaller dial that registered the corresponding time on Mars. Tommy's whole heart went out to it in an ecstasy of longing. He thought wistfully that if you could know what time it was there, you could imagine what everyone was doing, and it wouldn't seem so far away. Haltingly, he tried to explain. "Look, Mum," he said breathlessly, "it's almost 5 o'clock at home. Dewey will be coming up the barn to be fed. Gosh, do you suppose old Pete will remember about her?" His mother smiled at him reassuringly. "Of course he will, silly. Don't forget he was the one who caught and tamed her for you." Tommy gulped as he thought of Dewey, scarcely as tall as himself, the big, rounded, mouse-like ears, and the flat, cloven pads that could carry her so swiftly over the sandy Martian flatlands. One of the last dwindling herds of native Martian Deweys, burden carriers of a vanished race. She had been Tommy's particular pride and joy for the last 3 years. Behind him, Tommy heard his mother murmur under her breath, "Tom, the watch. Could we?" And his dad regretfully, "It's a pretty expensive toy for a youngster, Helen, and even a Rabara raiser's bank account has limits." "Of course, dear, it was silly of me." Helen smiled a little ruefully. "And if Mr. Crumbine has your watch ready, we must go. Bea and some of her friends are coming over, and it's only a few hours till you leave." Big Tom squeezed her elbow gently, understandingly, as she blinked back quick tears. Trailing after them, Tommy saw the little byplay, and his heart ached. The guilt complex building up in him grew and deepened. He knew he had only to say, "Look, I don't mind staying. Aunt Bea and I will get along swell," and everything would be all right again. Then the terror of this new and complex world, as it would be without a familiar face, swept over him and kept him silent. His overwrought feelings expressed themselves in a nervously rebelling stomach, culminating in a disgraceful moment over the nearest gutter. The rest of the afternoon he spent in bed recuperating. In the living room, Aunt Bea spoke her mind in her usual high-pitched voice. "It's disgraceful, Helen. A boy his age. None of the Bentons ever had nerves." His mother's reply was inaudible, but on the heels of his father's deeper tones, Aunt Bea's voice rose in rasping indignation. "Well, I never! And from my own brother, too. From now on, don't come to me for help with your spoiled brat. Goodbye!" The door slammed indignantly. His mother chuckled, and there was a spontaneous burst of laughter. Tommy relaxed and lay back happily. Anyway, that was the last of Aunt Bea. The next hour or two passed in a flurry of ringing phones, people coming and going, and last-minute words and reminders. Then suddenly it was time to leave. Dad burst in for a last quick hug and a promise to send him pictures of Dewey and her foal, due next month. Mother dropped a hasty kiss on his hair and promised to hurry back from the spaceport. Then Tommy was alone, with a large, painful lump where his heart ought to be. The only activity was the almost noiseless buzzing as the hotel android ran the cleaner over the living room. Presently, even that ceased, and Tommy lay relaxed and inert, sleepily watching the curtains blow in and out at the open window. 30 stories above the street, the noises were pleasantly muffled and remote, and his senses drifted aimlessly to and fro on the tides of half-sleep. Drowsily, his mind wandered from the hotel's android servants to the strictly utilitarian mechanical monstrosity at home, known affectionately as Old John, to the android showroom where they had seen the one that Dad said looked like Mother. He jolted suddenly, sickeningly awake. Suppose, his mind whispered treacherously, suppose that Dad had ordered one to take Mum's place. Not on Mars, but here while she returned to Mars with him. Suppose that instead of Mum he discovered one of those things, or even worse, suppose he went on from day to day not even knowing. It was a bad 5 minutes. He was wet with perspiration when he lay back on his pillows, a shaky smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had a secret defence against the terror. He giggled a little at the thought of what Aunt B would say if she knew. And what had brought him back from the edge of hysteria was a triumphant knowledge that with the abnormally acute hearing bred into the thin atmosphere of Mars, no robot ever created could hide from him the infinitesimal ticking of the electronic relays that gave it life. Secure at last, his overstrung nerves relaxed, and he slid gratefully over the edge of sleep. He woke abruptly, groping after some vaguely remembered sound. A soft clicking of heels down the hall. Of course, his mother back from the spaceport. Now she would be stopping at his door to see if he were asleep. He lay silently. Through his eyelashes he could see her outlined in the soft light from the hall. She was coming in to see if he was tucked in. In a moment he would jump up and startle her with a hug as she leaned over him. In a moment. Screaming desperately, he was out of bed, backing heedlessly across the room. He was still screaming as the low sill of the open window caught him behind the knees and toppled him 30 stories to the street. Alone in the silent room, Helen Benton stood dazed, staring blindly at the empty window. Tommy's parting gift from his father slid from her hand and lay on the carpet, still ticking gently. It was 9:23 on Mars.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
Murderer's Chain by Wenzell Brown. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, March 1960. Narrated by Tom Trussel. If Maudie had only given me the $10,000 to invest in the Martian Development Company, there would have been no reason to kill her. The money would have been more than tripled, and my financial troubles would have been over. But Maudie has always been so unreasonable. Even though she grudgingly admitted that I had been right in the Martian venture, she still had no faith in my business judgment. She was as adamant as ever about parting with the smallest fraction of her vast fortune when I had the opportunity to step in on the ground floor of the Balsavia 6 Mining Corporation. Balsavia 6, in case you don't know, is the newest planet which Earth's spaceships have touched. Everything about Balsavias has been kept strictly hush-hush. Only a handful of people have the slightest concept of the value of the new planet's mineral deposits. It just happened that one of the men in on the top secret was my friend Sylvester, and he was willing to cut me in on a slice of the corporation he was forming for as little as $5,000 on the line. The problem was how to get my hands on that much folding stuff. The answer should have been easy. Maudie, Mrs. Maud Terrain, was one of Earth's wealthiest women, and after all, Maudie was my mother-in-law. The trouble with Maudie was that she was narrow-minded, prejudiced, I might say bigoted. She liked to boast that her family have come from good solid earth stock from the beginning of time, and, while she mingled with the social elite from Venus, she considered Martians crude and refused to entertain guests from what she described as the minor planets. Maudie's second trouble was that she was mean. Although her daughter Isabel and I have been married for 8 years, Maudie never did more than to provide us with a modest allowance. She always felt that I should work, which, after all, is pretty nonsensical when there are so many ways for a man with a little capital to get rich quick. Isabel isn't like Maudie. She's easygoing, pliant, susceptible to flattery, and, on Maudie's death, Isabel would inherit her full fortune. So with a deal like this in the offing, it didn't take any great brain to see that Maudie's rapid demise would remove the single obstacle that stood between myself and untold wealth. The thought of killing Maudie had come often to my mind since my talk with Sylvester, but the available weapons all seemed too crude. I'm a fastidious person, and the idea of shooting or stabbing Maudie was just too vulgar. One of the more subtle poisons might have turned a trick, but certainly nothing as obvious as cyanide or arsenic. As for curare or Bellaston, to be frank, I hadn't the foggiest notion where to lay my hands on them. That's the way things stood when I just happened to stop in front of the window of Melvin Rosie's house of fantastic jewellery in Greenwich Village. I'd passed by the shop many times, but I'd never paused to look in. Of recent years, the village had filled up with all sorts of peculiar people, Martians, Venusians, and the little green men from outer space. One thing I'll have to hand to Maudie. She was right about calling some of these people uncouth. Some of the Galaxians really are riffraff. Out in front of the store were some long pink flyers advertising the jewellery within. I picked one up idly, for it had just occurred to me that Maudie's birthday was the next day, and that it might not be a bad idea to soften her up with a gift. I looked at the monstrous chunks of jewellery in the display window, rings, bracelets, whatnots, decorated with staring eyes, floating amoebas, and gilded kidneys. Maudie was a pushover for spectacular accoutrements, but this stuff exceeded even her flamboyant taste. Probably I would have walked on by if a couple of lines at the top of the flyer hadn't caught my attention. They were written by some old-time humorist called S.J. Perelman, and he described the jewellery as being like an egg balanced on a cone, an erg balanced on a bone, a hag balanced on a roan. That last part seemed a perfect description of Maudie, a hag balanced on a roan. Almost by instinct I started to climb the crooked stone steps to the shop. The door was open, and the proprietor was standing behind the counter. Other than that, the place was empty. I'd seen Melvin Rosie around before. He was a big brute of a man with a shaggy red beard who sported a dangling jade earring in his left ear. I'd always suspected that Rosie had Martian blood, but I'd never been sure until I glimpsed the little purple flecks in the lines of his palms that are a dead giveaway. Rosie looked up, and his gaze seemed to go right through me. Some of these Martian chaps have an uncanny skill at reading your mind. Rosie's voice was clear and soft, but it had the timbre of some stringed instrument. He said, "A gift, perhaps, for a woman?" I nodded, but I almost jumped out of my skin when he added, "For your mother-in-law, I should imagine. I'm sure I have just the thing." He showed me a half-dozen pendants and bracelets, but I could see his heart wasn't in it. He was sizing me up, wanting to make sure of me before he offered the pièce de résistance. I could feel excitement surging up inside me, even though I had no notion of what it would bring forth. Finally, he went to the rear of the shop and disappeared behind a batik curtain. When he returned, he held in his hand a heart-shaped box of deep napped velvet, royal purple in colour. He laid the box on the glass counter, but his wide palm nearly covered it. His eyes held mine, and his thick lips quirked in a smile that was almost a grimace. he said. "I take it you want an extra special gift. I might say a gift for the departing, even a fatal gift." I gulped and nodded. He raised the box and slipped the catch. The lid rose slowly on coiled hinges, and I was staring at the most delicately wrought necklace I had ever seen. It was long and thin, no wider than a shoestring, and the clasp was a beautifully constructed replica of a snake's head. I looked at the intricate design of the narrow chain with wonder. Certainly it was not a product of Earth, I thought. Nowhere on this planet do we have craftsmen capable of such elaboration of minutiae. Even more striking than the workmanship on the chain was its coloration. It was not gold, as I had first thought, but a metal unknown to me with a flame-like orange glow. My gaze was drawn away from the necklace by Rosie's soft chuckle. "It is magnificent, is it not?" "Yes," I said, "but far beyond my means. I had in mind some trifle." Rosie lifted a hand for silence, and again I noticed the purple flecks in the palm. He said, "Nothing is too expensive for the woman you hate." I began to stutter a protest, but something in Rosie's expression stopped me. He spoke gently, as though humoring a child. "We do not need to discuss price. The necklace will make you a wealthy man. We can settle upon terms then." "I don't understand." "Ah, but you will," he said, smiling. "You do not recognize the metal. There is nothing strange about that. Probably no man of Earth have ever seen it and lived. In Mars it has been given the name of malutrex, and even here it is both rare and extremely expensive because of its peculiar properties. In all, I doubt if more than a dozen such necklaces were made up. They are called," he stopped to underscore his point, "murderers' chains." I think he expected me to ask why, but for some reason my throat was so dry that I couldn't trust myself to speak. "You will recall," he continued slowly, "that way back in the 20th century, when the Martians first came to Earth, they were not made exactly welcome. Our first spaceships were fired upon, and many of our people were killed. Our next step was secret infiltration. We landed our ships in deserts and other isolated spots and unloaded select groups to intermingle with the Earth people, and, because we are a superior race, soon many of our representatives held important posts among the governments of the Earth, especially that of the United States. To these Martians fell the task of breaking down ancient prejudices so that Earth could be opened to unrestricted trade and immigration. This was not easy. The men of Earth still remained hostile to us, and, when we were unmasked as Martians, many of us were imprisoned, and some were beaten to death, even executed. The people of Earth were, as a whole, complacent, but they were whipped up to a frenzy by scaremongers and demagogues whose voices it became necessary to silence. Open retaliation would have done more harm than good, and it was then that the Martians found the perfect weapon. Malutrex. This is a metal quite harmless to Martians, for, as you know, our blood has a quite different composition than yours. We can handle Malutrex without the slightest danger. Look." He reached down, coiled the slender chain about his wrist, caught the hook in the tongue-like catch for the delicate clasp, then unloosened it again. He smiled and was silent for a minute, studying my face. When he spoke again, it was with slow deliberation. "Maybe you remember hearing tales long ago of the silent death. Certain isolationist congressmen and senators who spearheaded the opposition to interplanetary development died mysteriously and without visible cause. Malotrex was the cause of their deaths." I was culling out half-forgotten bits of information that I had learned as a schoolboy. But how? Again, the purple-flecked palm raised to interrupt me. Earthmen are hot-blooded. The chemical analysis of their bodies. But I won't bother you with the technicalities. In plain language, once a chain of Malotrex circles human flesh, it begins to shrink, slowly, almost invisibly. It grows tighter and tighter until it becomes a strangler's noose, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that the Earthman can do about it. Once the clasp is fastened, no matter how he tries, he cannot undo it, nor, after a few minutes, can he loosen the chain from his skin. In most cases, the victim is taken completely unaware by the death creeping upon him. Malotrex constricts gradually and painlessly, except for the last spluttering moment of life. My knees felt a little weak, and my stomach queasy. Why tell me? Why should you let me in on this secret? Rosie's smile became more intimate. "Mrs. Terrain is not exactly popular among Martians," he said softly. "If I remember correctly, she is the chairman of the League to Oppose Interplanetary Marriage, and has financed the Earth Citizens Council, to name only a few of the discriminatory organizations with which she has linked herself. Perhaps you, as her heir, could put her fortune to a better use." "There's no doubt of that," I said. "Well then. But I've no desire to be dissolved in the death ray chamber for murder. Nor is there any need to do so. Look, was a single one of our assassins caught? But the necklace would be found embedded in her flesh." He shook his head. "Perhaps I've not made the situation clear. The pumping of the heart, the warmth of the blood, cause Malotrex to contract. As soon as death sets in, the necklace resumes its normal proportions. The clasp can be unfastened, the necklace removed, and as long as the ends do not meet, it remains completely harmless." I gulped again. Murder in the abstract is one thing. Planned, cold-blooded murder is something else again. But Maudie dead, and all that money in my hands. Suddenly I laughed as I saw where my thoughts were leading me. The whole thing was a hoax of some kind. As before, Rosie seemed to read my mind. He reached for my wrist and twisted the necklace about it. I stared at the delicate change in fascination. As I watched, I could see the metal shrink, barely perceptibly, but certainly for all that. I clawed at the clasp and tried to unfasten it. It was utterly hopeless, and swift panic swept over me. I grasped the slender chain and tried to wrench it free. It was tougher than finely tempered steel. Sweat popped out on my forehead, and I could hardly repress a scream. With a knowing nod of his head, Rosie leaned forward and lifted my wrist. He opened the catch with a lazy flick of his fingers. I was breathing hard and scared half out of my wits, but I was caught in the trap that Rosie had set for me. Maudie dead, myself a millionaire, and no chance of being caught. This was too good to pass up. I knew it, and so did Rosie. All we had to do was agree on terms. Half an hour later, when I left the House of Fantastic Jewellery, the royal purple box with the murderer's chain lay in my pocket, beautifully gift-wrapped. I had to lay my plans carefully, but unwittingly. Maudie and Isabel conspired to make it easy. A dinner had been arranged at Maudie's apartment as a birthday celebration. The only other guests would be Sylvester and his wife. Maudie had been complaining of bad headaches of late, and never liked to go out after dinner, but she had purchased 4 tickets for the most popular play of the season, The Fairest of Ladies, and insisted that the 4 of us should see it. She would rest while we were gone, but would keep her light on so that Isabel could come in to kiss her good night. Everything went like clockwork. I bought a little gift for Maudie and presented it to her early in the evening. The dinner was very gay, and just as we were about to leave, I announced that I had another gift. Maudie was delighted with the chain. I didn't even have to fasten it around her neck as I had planned. She snapped the clasp herself and went to the mirror in the foyer, preening and admiring herself, and the necklace that winked and glittered in the light. I was the last one out of the door, and Maudie clung to me for a minute, drawing my head down to kiss me. Maybe she'd softened up enough to lend me a few thousand, I thought. But even if she had, it was too late. I couldn't very well snatch the necklace back, even if it were possible to release it from about her throat. I don't remember much about the play. I was thinking of Maudie all the time, and I was torn between all sorts of doubts and fears. One minute I'd be way down in the dumps, and the next I'd be floating up in the clouds, planning all the good times Isabel and I could have with Maudie's millions. In my mind, I'd see a picture of Maudie lying dead, and then I'd decide that Rosie had conned me, and Maudie would be as spry as ever when we got home. Sometimes I'd want it one way, and sometimes the other. I was really mixed up and on edge. The play seemed to last for about 10 light years, but actually it wasn't quite midnight when we caught a taxi outside the theatre. As soon as we rounded the corner and were in sight of the marquee of the apartment house, I knew something had gone wrong. 2 red and white police cars blocked off the entrance of the house, and a curious throng of people had gathered around. I'd expected to have a chance to retrieve the necklace before the police were called. In the confusion of discovering her body, no one would notice, or, even if someone did, it wouldn't appear particularly odd for me to unfasten the necklace and slip it in my pocket. After all, it would have been my last gift to her. With the police already on the scene, that part of the plan was out. Nothing was left except to play it by ear. We pushed our way through the curious idlers and the neighbours who'd come out into the halls. A cop was at the front door, but as soon as we'd identified ourselves, he ushered us into Maudie's big front room. Only 2 cops were there. I didn't get the smaller one's name, but the towering man in plain clothes introduced himself as Lieutenant Onset of Central Homicide. Just the mention of homicide was enough to give me the jitters bad, but fortunately Isabel stole the scene with a fit of hysterics that nearly blew the roof off the place. She distracted everyone with her screaming jag, long enough for me to slip into the bedroom for a look at Maudie. She lay straight on the bed, her arms flung out, her face contorted and blue, but not a mark on her throat. What I wanted most was to get my hands on the necklace, but when I drew close to her, I could see that it was gone. I stood still, breathing hard, trying to collect my wits. Could the necklace have slipped off after death? I scanned the bedclothes, the carpet beside the bed, the medicine table. No sign of it. I hadn't heard anyone enter the room, but when I looked up, I found myself staring into the pale grey eyes of Lieutenant Onset. His face wore an official mask of blankness, but it was belied by the quirk of his lips. He knew something, I thought, or at least he was suspicious. I had to take a firm grip on myself not to make a break for it and try to rush past him to the freedom of the hall. Onset motioned me back to the front room. Isabel had quieted down, although she was still sobbing. Sylvester and his wife were sitting on the divan holding hands and looking distraught. I went to Isabel and slid my arms around her and waited to see what would come next. The questioning was all very polite, in perfect order. The details of the birthday dinner and the theatre party came out. We learned in turn that a friend of Maudie's, who had a key to the apartment, had dropped in to surprise her with a birthday gift and had discovered the body. There was some mention of the necklace, but neither Onset nor his partner pursued the matter. I was beginning to feel cocky again, sure that Maudie's death would be put down to accidental strangulation or a heart attack. In about an hour, we were all told that we could leave, but just as we got to the door, Onset called me back and asked me to wait. Sylvester offered to take Isabel home, and I didn't dare to protest too much. I stood in the middle of the room, listening to their footsteps die away in the hall, and then I turned to face Onset. His partner had disappeared, and the two of us were alone in the room. He sat down in an easy chair and crossed his legs. There wasn't anything for me to do but try to appear as much at ease as he. We sat there in silence for long minutes. Finally, Onset dug out a cigarette and offered me one. I took it and lit up. The smoke burned my throat, but having something to do with my hands helped. I was scared, but I reckoned that the best thing to do was put on a show of indignation. "What is this?" I blustered. "I've told you everything I know." He gave a thin smile. "I don't think so, Mr. Duff." "I don't care what you think. I've nothing more to say." He snuffed out his cigarette very carefully in one of Maudie's little mosaic ashtrays, and slowly his hand dipped into his pocket. When it came out, the necklace dangled from his fingers. I could feel my heart lurch, but I still tried to bluff it out, complaining about being separated from Isabel. Onset didn't say a word, just dangled the chain so that the light from the lamp rippled along its slender surface. In a few minutes I ran out of words. Onset gave a deep sigh and rose from his chair. "Do you want to tell me about this little gift to your mother-in-law?" I clamped my lips shut. "I'm through. Finished. I'll not say another word." The quirk of his lips reminded me of Melvin Rosey. He raised the chain over my head, and the next thing I knew it was about my throat. My fingers scrabbled for it, but I couldn't pry it loose. I gave up and stared at Onset in stunned silence. His hands were still outstretched, and as I looked up at them, I could see the tiny purple flecks in his palms. I couldn't believe it, not at first. Whoever heard of a Martian making the New York police force? But when he spoke, his voice had dropped its growl. It was soft and musical, a Martian voice. He said, "I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know. You'll write it all down, too." Like I said before, it's really uncanny the way some of these Martian chaps can read your mind. He was right, straight down the line. I told him everything. I wrote it all down and didn't waste any time about it because every second the necklace was growing smaller and smaller. When I finished, I signed it and pushed it over to him. Here it is.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. If you're not subscribed, why ever not? It's free.